Good afternoon. My name is Pamela Frasch, and I want to thank you all and congratulate you for being here on the last day at the last panel. We've got an amazing superstar panel for you, so I'm really glad you're here. This panel will examine the intersection of animal studies, law, ethics, religion, and cultural considerations. And the panelists will shed light on the religious and cultural aspects of animal law, offering thought-provoking reflections on the diverse belief systems and traditions that inform our relationship with non-human animals. So all three of our panelists are incredibly accomplished, and I could go on for hours and hours about their background. So I'm going to be very, very short in the introduction, but please do look them up. There's more information on the conference website, and also if you just Google them directly. So our first speaker is Paul Waldau. He's an educator, scholar, and activist working at the intersection of animal studies, law, ethics, religion, and cultural studies. He was an associate professor at Canisius College in Buffalo, New York, where he was the senior faculty for the Master of Science program in anthrozoology. As the former director of the Center for Animals and Public Policy, Dr. Waldau taught veterinary ethics and public policy at Tufts University School of Veterinary Medicine for more than a decade. He has a PhD from the University of Oxford, a JD from UCLA, and an MA in religious studies from Stanford University. Jaya Nuggehalli is going to be our second speaker, and he is the co-founder and chief operating officer of Global Food Partners. Global Food Partners is an international consulting company that provides innovative solutions to meet the growing demand for higher welfare products, with a focus on cage-free egg sourcing and production. He previously served as managing director of Humane Society International, India, and was involved in the expansion of the organization in Asia. And he was also the founding director of the Animal Law Center at Nalsar School, University of Law in Hyderabad, India. And he's a member of the Animal Welfare Board of India. And then Everett Chinoda is the founder of Speak Out for Animals, SOFA, which is located in Zimbabwe. And under her leadership, SOFA has facilitated the training of lawyers, prosecutors, magistrates, investigators, and students on animal and wildlife law. She's authored essential resources, including the Wildlife Legal Guide, Wildlife Law Code, and a rapid reference guide for Zimbabwe. And as a point of pride for me, she also holds a master's degree in animal law from Lewis and Clark Law School, and in fact was the very first attorney in Zimbabwe to practice animal law and to receive that education. She previously worked as a lawyer for the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority and also served as a prosecutor for 3 years under the National Prosecuting Authority in Zimbabwe. She was named the best corporate lawyer in all of Zimbabwe in 2021 and has been honored as one of the top 100 young African conservation leaders. So with that, let us welcome our first speaker, Paul Waldau.
First of all, thank you to the conference conveners. It's such a privilege to be part of this panel, but to be in this family and this community is energizing. I'm going to speak to the animal invitation. There's a title of an upcoming book by me, but what we're really after here is anticipating law's intersectional future. We'll discuss a bit of what that term means from time to time. Modern secular law has been deeply influenced by human-centered habits of mind. Those habits of mind are deeply rooted in emphases that come out of our deep history, and particularly the connections to the Abrahamic religious traditions, mainline European ethics, and Western sciences practiced over recent centuries. Exploration of these non-legal influences offers important perspectives. We can, for example, recognize harms that grow out of human exceptionalism, and that's the view that humans are so special that even our minor interests outweigh the major interests of any and all non-human animals. And we can also recognize that these harms impact both non-humans and humans as well. Let's make sure this works. We also can recognize that benefits arrive when humans communities teach their children a wider sense of community based on ecocentric, compassion-focused values. Such values are still characteristic of many small-scale indigenous communities, of course, but they animate many concerned citizens, and this conference is as good an exemplification of that as I've ever experienced. Familiarity with the problem of human exceptionalism helps all of us recognize that modern legal systems have caused, but alternatively can also blunt many harms to Earth's life communities. How might we anticipate an intersectional future for animal law? Be frank about the harms of human exceptionalism inside and beyond the species line. You might think human exceptionalism advantages all humans. Quite far from that, however. Being frank offers us a chance to consider compassionate possibilities in two spheres often separated in the academic world. Humans' one-on-one relationships with individual animals, often seen as an ethics question, and our larger human communities' relationships to non-human animal communities and ecosystems, sometimes seen as the environmental question. When both approaches are considered, it is possible to recognize that our inherited social and cultural values have, through the use of phrases like humans and animals, weakened our sense of humans' obvious membership in the Earth's multi-species, more than human community. The pioneers who developed the first and second ways of animal law, which is a wonderful feature of this course that they're here, recognize the importance of what we now name with terms like intersectional and interdisciplinary. For example, Steve Wise's Rattling the Cage had a chapter on chimpanzee and bonobo minds. The early ways of animal law have already had impacts beyond the legal realm. In the coming next weekend, I'll be at Yale at a meeting of scholars of religion. Out of my element there, of course, but we'll hear about, and they're going to hear about the pioneering impacts of animal law on broad animal studies considerations and on them as well. Because I think animal law is the cutting edge in recent decades and has so much potential to help the other disciplines get further along. My goal today is to push this law-focused group to see possibilities and some peculiar limits of today's academic programs and disciplines. In particular, how established disciplines and programs sometimes become merely infrastructure in search of self-perpetuation. And they show that in the way they sometimes seek funding and also the prevalence of very specialized vocabulary that's technical and that's characteristic of very discipline-specific scholarship. An alternative is discipline transcending work that illuminates humans' multifaceted relationships with non-human animals. Seeing the roots of the problem. Well, this can be fostered by asking which living beings are protected by the secular legal systems of the contemporary world. Nominally all humans in our democracy, but everybody knows that politically the answer is far fewer. This exclusion is called out in discussions of intersectionality, defined by one popular source as a sociological, analytical framework for understanding how groups and individuals' social and political identities result in unique combinations of discriminations and privilege. Examples of these factors include gender, caste, sex, race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, religion, disability, height, age, weight, and obviously many more categories. But notice how all of those categories just listed by that definition are widely read in ways that begin and end with discussions of humans alone. So what does it mean? Let's explore, what does it mean to be truly intersectional and interdisciplinary? We can ask questions like this: where and how do we learn about animals of any kind? By looking carefully in specific worlds. Animals are always in a specific world, each individual. We look at non-human animals in their natural settings and our human intersections with other than human animals. By noticing how fully our education systems have historically been dominated by the claim that humans are the paradigmatically intelligent animal on Earth, we can learn something about how we've been framing the issue. This is the same exceptionalist claim that dominated our secular legal systems from their inception in the last millennium, in the 11th century. The same claim dominates most of today's institutionalized religious circles, the ones I'll speak to next week. Many scientific establishments and the mainline traditions of our species' moral reasoning over the last centuries. If we explore how single discipline thinking has so often ghettoized our understanding, we reach further heights. Without questions, or with questions and observations, however, we can stimulate our impressive human abilities in matters of critical thinking. This conference has exemplified that again and again and again, with talented people coming up, making observations, and other talented people listening and realizing, yeah, wow, thank you, that's helpful. So we can look, for example, honestly, frankly, forthrightly at our own grand claims about ourselves. We are clearly mammals, primates, and thus animals. So why the prevalence of the phrase humans and animals? I'll come back to this, but why the prevalence of that phrase? Well, sometimes I would invite my students in graduate programs to do a personal archaeology, the task of recognizing how each of us was taught to learn about animals. Did the people who taught us know anything about them, or did we just follow whatever we were told and not go explore the world on our own? I will suggest to you that there are benefits for animal law that come from it being intersectional and interdisciplinary. There's a related task. How do we learn to look carefully in specific local worlds? In the last panels, people were talking about cetaceans and how to explore. We're incredibly genius at this, but we have to learn from others. We look at non-human animals quite openly in natural settings and can learn as well. And we can also look just as frankly, just as carefully at ourselves in the often imbalanced intersections with other than human animals in those local worlds we overwhelmingly dominate. We have caused a lot of extinctions and are causing more every day. Animal law has already led many to see how fully one-dimensional exceptionalist claims has shaped secular legal systems. Many questions in the question and answer sessions have asked people, how do we use law for more? Because we have really constrained the focus to some human groups, once in a while to all humans. We can notice that the same values that constrain legal systems to look primarily at humans dominate the realms of education, institutionalized religious circles, scientific practice, and contemporary humans' moral reasoning. As someone mentioned the other day, every law class can be an animal law class. So too, every educational exercise can be an animal studies exercise. We are, after all, animals learning about other animals. So we have lots of potential to understand animal issues. And there's a reason to hope for a more inclusive future. Our impressive abilities in human groups, so fully exemplified in this conference, when it comes to matters of critical thinking, we help each other think better when we talk frankly and openly. This is why the classroom matters. We can, for example, look honestly and forthrightly at politically risky issues. So let me come back to humans and animals. Our daily language along that line bifurcates the world in a completely unnatural way. And not only is it unscientific, it's positively anti-scientific to use the phrase humans and animals. What's the message? It's that we lack self-knowledge, that we're animals, and any ability we bring to a group is an animal ability. It might well exist elsewhere in the world. How much can we do through secular law alone? Obviously a great deal, but also see the history. Secular legal systems were from their inception in the 11th century dominated by human-centered assumptions. We haven't left those. for over a millennium now. This is true of other disciplines, although in the margins today, one can find concern for non-human animals in the study of religion. That'll surprise some, but it's definitely there, and it has always been. Philosophy, ethics, and the social sciences like anthropology and sociology. These margins reveal that animal law advocates have a growing number of potential allies in other fields, which can be helpful when working to get beyond the prejudices that shape thinking anchored in only a single discipline. And law on its own is isolated, but law in conjunction with others can do an absolutely startlingly wonderful dance. So what's the task at hand? Develop modern legal traditions in conjunction with other disciplines and thereby increase prospects of convincing human societies that individuals are enriched when they coexist with Earth's other living beings and communities. Such interdisciplinary efforts and encouraging news of relevant developments, as has happened throughout this conference, are outlined in two books I did, one in 2016 with Oxford University Press, Animal Studies, an introduction, and then the forthcoming book from Brill, The Animal Invitation, Science, Ethics, Religion, and Law in a More Than Human Field. I like going to conferences, but I'm always aware that I'm incompetent in the particular conference I'm in relative to the people who do only that field. But that's actually a learning experience for me, and I'm coping with it. So I'm going to give you a concluding plea. Only a century ago, Daniel Ingram's the Law of Animals, the field of animal law, was pitched to exploiting the living beings of the earth in Earth's other than human communities. We were exploiting them as mere resources, but we've come in an amazing distance. Our task is to amplify the astonishing vigor in the animal law programs, so wonderfully on display here, and help realize Thomas Berry. Thomas Berry was a Catholic priest who was sometimes referred to as a geologian because he theorized about the whole earth. He was an expert in indigenous traditions. His insight: we cannot be truly ourselves in any adequate manner without all our companion beings throughout the earth. The larger community constitutes our greater self. Animal law programs can model for everyone, and has been doing that for a while, the importance of an interdisciplinary, intersectional journey, thereby affirming that human societies are capable of an encompassing vision of our larger community. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's a delight to be here. So in my presentation, what I'm going to do is, okay, I think we skipped let's try. Okay. We'll kind of keep focus on India, because I know, like, for most people, the minute you say India, what comes to your mind is cows, ahimsa, land of animals, so on and so forth. When you really look at the most dominant religion in India, Hinduism, animals have always played a very, very important role. You can think of an animal and it's got some sort of a sacred reference in an Indian mythology. You could have the elephant god Ganesh, who has a very funny story of his creation. So his mother Parvati was bathing in the Himalayas, didn't want anyone to come in and disturb. So she takes the mythology says that she takes the dirt from her body, creates this little boy, and says that don't let anyone in. Parvati's husband Shiva, he comes to visit his wife, and this kid's really following his mom's instruction and is like, sorry, I'm not letting you in. He obviously gets really angry because there's this random kid who's not letting him walk in and see his wife. So he takes an axe, chops this kid's head off, and walks to meet his wife. And then Parvati is now really angry. She's like, how dare you kill this baby? And so he finds a solution. Shiva asks his followers to go and find the first living being which is sleeping with its head towards a particular direction, chop its head and bring it to him so that he's able to put the head back to this child that he just decapitated. They found a baby calf. They killed the calf, brought the head in, put it together, and there you have Lord Ganesh, one of the most loved gods in India. Next to him is Narasimha, Another god who is half lion and half human. Again, it comes from a very interesting story. There's a demon, and the demon basically says, does a very big penance for years and years. And the Lord comes before him and asks him, what do you want? And he says, well, I want to be immortal. And it's like, well, you can't be immortal. Like, immortality is just for gods. You're just a human being. We can't give you immortality. So this guy's like, okay, can I ask for a wish? And he's like, what's your wish? I don't want to be killed by a human. Granted. I don't want to be killed by an animal. Granted. I don't want to die in morning or at night. Sure, why not? I don't want to die on the ground nor in the air. Sure. I don't want to be killed by anything that's born to another human being. Sure. I don't want to be killed by a weapon. So broadly got his immortality. And then very clever. And then he obviously ends up being this demon who's like terrorizing everyone. And this little boy that you see front is this demon's son, Prahalada. And he's like constantly opposed to his dad's atrocities against his citizens. And then at some point of time, they both have some sort of a debate. And then he's like, where is God? I'm really God and I'm really powerful. So Prahalada says, well, God's everywhere. He's omnipresent, omnipotent. And he's like, that's bullshit. It's like, he's not everywhere. Like, I literally had to stand in penance for days and days and years to actually get him. So he's not. So then he says, there was a pillar. And he says, well, is this God inside a pillar? And Prahalada is very confident. He's like, of course, he's in the pillar. So his dad takes a weapon, breaks the pillar, and behold, from this pillar, because not born to another animal, comes this creature, the god Narasimha, who is half human, half animal. So he's neither human nor animal. This happens in the evening, which is neither day nor night. Then he grabs Prahalada. But there was another thing. He shouldn't die inside nor outside his house. So he goes to the threshold of the door, puts 1 foot inside the house, 1 foot outside the house, this god, then puts this demon, Hiranyakashipu, on his thigh, so because he's neither on sky nor on the ground. Then he uses his claws, because it's not a weapon, and then kills him. Right. So the story, again, is just to say that from a very long time, this whole distinction between humans and animals has never existed within Indian mythology. So you'll see this picture, Ganesha with his 2 wives, Siddhi and Buddhi. You'll see Narasimha with his wife, Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth. And then you can pick up at any animal. So you could see a crow who is seen as dead people, like, dead ancestors come and visit you as a crow. So on their death anniversary, a crow is fed. And it's said that, well, if you actually feed a crow, then the food somehow goes to the ancestors. You could have a snake. You could think of an animal, rat. So for example, Ganesha actually rides a rat. So his vehicle is a rat. So every animal that you really think of, there is some sort of religious, cultural aspect to it. And there's broadly a sense that animals are sacred. Now, just because animals are sacred, does that necessarily mean that somehow they're also treated well? And I feel like a lot of times in people's mind, you say that, well, animals are sacred in India, so they obviously must be taken care of well. That's not true. And I think some of them goes back to our agrarian background. So the first one is Jallikattu, and I think for anybody who's read anything about Indian common law judgment, Nagaraja talks about rights of animals, so on and so forth, all came from Jallikattu, which I'm not getting into the legal debate of it, but at the point of time, the Constitution Bench of India kind of overturned a big piece of Nagaraja, but we'll get to that a little later. Be it cockfighting, be it Kambala, each of these, which probably were traditions that were started off to identify the right gene. So you still see that it's the food animals and we trait selection. So for example, Jallikattu was a very interesting tradition. It was trait selection for a human being as well as the bull, because you would have these bulls who are raised who's raised to become very angry and aggressive, and they're left into an arena, and there'd be hundreds of men who would get on, and whoever could hold on to the hump of the bull and let it cross the line was declared a Veera or a winner. And the bull obviously got a lot of money to be mated so that the progeny kind of continues and you had like a really good gene. And the man could choose a bride of his choice. So I guess both of those in that sense was some sort of genetic selection happening. Similarly, I guess with cockfights and Kambala and so on and so forth. So in one hand, we do, when you think about India, you think about everything that Indian or Hinduism broadly brings with relation to its mythology, sacredness. And then on the other hand, you obviously have a lot of suffering that happens primarily because of the agrarian society. And of course, if you were to draw the timeline, then we also have industrial animal agriculture, as in India is now the second largest producers of chicken meat, eggs, all of which confined in industrial agriculture. And cows is another word that kind of comes up when we talk about India. And cow again happens to be more of a political tool than anything. And this is a very interesting one. You might think that this must be going actually for a slaughterhouse. It's actually not from a slaughterhouse. Right behind you see this picture, that's Lord Krishna, one of the, again, a very well adored king, lord in India who happens to be a cowherd. And then this whole thing about purity of milk comes from this incarnation overall. And they actually had brought, this was a picture that was taken, which was a demonstration against cow slaughter, because there's a ask for a nation-wide ban on cow slaughter, which doesn't exist. And you'll see even at that particular point of time, like these people who proposedly are asking that there should be a national-wide ban on cow slaughter can't even possibly build a ramp to load that particular animal up. And similarly, when you talk about dairy cows, all the animal suffering that happens in India with relation to dairy cows, or when you really look at water buffalo, you see that, had obviously no protection at all because only cows are sacred, water buffaloes are not, even though we end up using them for milk. Animals, even though have been used in part of like mythology and worship, they've also been a great tool against, a great tool for oppression. India's caste system has always kind of divided in such a way that, be it, for example, the collection of dead animals or the work of tannery was always left to the lower caste. And it was seen as something not pure at all and not to be done. And then when it comes to animal sacrifices, again, a lot of it which is being done by the lower caste within the Indian caste system has been looked down upon by many people. But then you kind of see that when the Supreme Court kind of came in and we adopted common law, they have started to see whether if you were to abolish animal sacrifice and say, well, sacrifice of animals has to be prohibited, they're using a similar line, and I think that's an intersectionality. So the picture here is of a chamar, a Dalit community in India who is actually making leather bottle. And what the Supreme Court says is that the untouchability provision, they kind of take that ahead and said that you need to liberate the society from rituals and the animal sacrifices gets banned. We also see animals or issues relating to animals in food law as a weapon against minorities. Recently, as halal ban. So as you all know, halal happens to be one of the world's most largest food certifier in many sense. And with the growth of Hindu nationalism, suddenly they're one of the most populous nation in India decided to ban halal certificate. And in fact, there were protests against Starbucks because they had like a halal certificate that was put up. And but then the Supreme Court stayed it. So again, in many terms, this isn't really about cow protection, but it's mostly using animals as a tool. It could have been animals as dead animals as a tool, or removal of dead animals as a tool against Dalit community, use of halal certification, cow slaughter as an issue to go against the Islamic community. And when it's come to religious practices and how courts have dealt with, it's always been like some sort of a reasonable restriction, and I'm not going to get into details of it, but the balance that the courts have tried to do is something a fundamental tenet of religion, because in our constitution does provide for fundamental right for religion, of course, but it also says that people have a duty to be kind to an animal. So we have a constitutional duty to be kind. But in the courts that really are looking at is At one particular point of time, how do you restrict the right to profess one's religion versus all these complexities that we see when religion is interacting with animals? And the question really has been that, does this particular practice form a fundamental tenet to that religion? On some issues, the courts have been good. For example, animal sacrifices. The courts have said that animal sacrifice is not a fundamental tenet of religion, of Hinduism. And in fact, when it comes to Qurbani, they have said that, well, there is during Bakri Eid time that it might be a fundamental tenet of Islam, but it still has to be done in a slaughterhouse, can't be done on streets, so on and so forth. But wherever things have happened and the courts have said some things are banned, there is always a big pull and push between the legislature and the judiciary. So even you really go back to Jallikattu itself, even though the Supreme Court of India said that it was unnecessary pain and suffering and prohibited, when you apply the doctrine of necessity, the big question that still arises is who decides what's necessary? It's easy for the court to say, well, is this necessary as a fundamental tenet of a religion? But if you were to not do that in the sense of like, if it's culture where there isn't, the test is not so much and there isn't a constitutional protection, then the question really comes, is this suffering necessary or unnecessary? And in that exception, who does it? We would obviously want the common law courts to have the final say, but the parliament obviously wants their final say on this. And currently what's happening is, as and when common law courts, be the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court, that's the Supreme Court as well, or the high courts in India, go ahead and make a ruling giving either rights to animals or issue a writ of mandamus to do something, then the default is for the legislature to act in and create exception between the statutes, say that, well, we believe that there could be an exception to the rule overall when it comes to necessary suffering. And we're seeing this again follow through in our neighboring countries as well. Here, the Supreme Court came in and said that they, in fact, used an extraterritorial jurisdiction and said even exporting animals from India to Nepal for Gadimai would be considered illegal. And there is overall a lot in the sense like, so all I'm trying to say is just like give a small taste. In some sense, we're making progress where the courts seem to be saying, well, if it's not a fundamental tenet of religion, we'll go ahead and extend. In some places, culture kind of comes in, and when culture comes in, then you have vote bank politics and they're holding back. And then finally, it all comes down to what the solution is. And I guess the ray of hope really seems to be coming from technology. A lot of Asian elephants are kept captive in Indian temples, and they lead a really, really horrible life. Now, groups such as PETA are now providing these mechanical elephants, which look like elephants, to these temples. So they're like donating them. So maybe there's a technology solution out. On animal sacrifices, we are seeing people using pumpkin, coconut, and others to sacrifice instead of a live animal. So there is some sort of a change that's coming in. Overall, it's complex. Animals are sacred. Animals are political tools. Animals are tools to be attacked against minorities. And animals are also super exploited in terms of industrial animal agriculture. And this really isn't one single pathway forward, but I guess understanding that the rights of animals and welfare of animals cuts across multiple issues just makes this work more complex, yet really interesting as the whole discipline of animal welfare grows in India. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I'll be talking about animals, religion, and culture in Africa. And the objective of my presentation will just be to explore the significance of animals in Africa, religion, and culture. So I'll start by talking about the significance of animals in the African culture and religion. Animals are an integral part of the African culture, and they shape the behavior, they shape the attitude of humans towards animals, and also they shape even the laws that are crafted and that are drafted with regards to the relationship with animals. For Africans, there's a cultural identity aspect that is very important. And also animals they're sacred, just like what the previous speaker said. And also we've got the issue of totemic practices and also rituals and sacrifices. An example of some cultural practices that are associated with animals are like, for example, with totems, a lion is associated with, symbolizes royalty, strength, wisdom, and courage. So you find that most of the people who live with the lions or who interact with the lions, especially in the rural areas, believe that if they can find a bone or a skin of a lion, keep it in their house, they will have some sort of royalty, some sort of strength. So those characteristics that we know about a lion is what human beings want to also be and associate with. So they'll try by all means to get a piece or a part of that animal so that they can also be wise, be courageous, or be dominating. And then the zebra represents freedom and individuality. So we have some people that actually have totems of zebras, and their characteristics is that of individuality, they are outspoken, they are free. And then we also have the elephant signifying strength, dignity, and good luck. And we also have the tortoise signifying patience, wisdom, and longevity. And then the leopard associated with strength and agility, and then crocodiles being cunning and also adaptability. So these are just examples of different types of animals that different people relate with. So you at times you can choose which animal you prefer or you want to imitate or to be. But in most of the cases, you are born into a certain clan or into a certain particular animal. Like, for example, I am from the lion tribe. That's why you see me courageous and brave. But so you grow up associating with that particular lion, and even our relationship, our social relationships, I cannot marry somebody who is from the lion tribe because we are related. I can only marry people that are from the zebra or any other animal. That's how our culture is like in terms of the social aspect. We also have some other myths and beliefs, especially related with birds, where like the eagle is regarded as a royal bird and a messenger from the ancestors. So if people see the eagle, they believe it's a message from the ancestor trying to tell them something. Normally in communities, there are certain things that will be happening. Like, for example, maybe the wells will be dry, or maybe there's a veiled fire, or certain things that will be just happening in the community. And then if they see an eagle, they will be saying, okay, I think the ancestors are not happy with this, or the ancestors are trying to communicate a certain thing. And they strongly believe in these things. And then we also have like the storkbirds and swallowbird, which are associated with the onset of rain. So when you see those birds, it's an indication that, okay, fine, we're expecting rains. Now with the climate change, vis-a-vis our own beliefs or cultural beliefs, people are no longer seeing those birds, so the ancestors are not happy. We must be doing something wrong, because ordinarily in October and in November, people used to see these birds and know and expect that the rains must be on the way. And then the owl is also a significant, but also a very, an animal that is also associated with witchcraft activities. So if you are seen with an owl at your house, then people do not want to associate with you, because they think that you travel with a broom in the night, and you bring bad spells to people, things like that. So an owl is not an animal that is common, that is loved in our culture, because of the belief that it brings bad omen, and it is also considered as the presence of witches, especially at night. And then we also have the vultures in Africa, which are regarded as sacred and associated with God's divine energy, death, and afterlife. People in the rural areas especially want to have at least the head or the feet of a vulture. And because of that demand, we've seen a decline in the vulture population because of those myths and because of those beliefs. They believe that the vulture is able to see far and beyond because of its characteristics. So if you want to foretell the future, if you want to know whether you're going to pass the bar, you need to have a piece, you need to have maybe the head or the feet of a vulture. So these animals will be on demand depending with what is happening in your life and in your situation. And there's also, in terms of a sacredness, or also a part of the culture and myths and beliefs. We have something that we call the avenging spirits, where certain people believe that when somebody dies, they still come back and they still communicate with you. If they're not happy with what happened when you're alive, they will still find their way back into the family, onto the community. So like, for example, last week when I was preparing for this presentation, there was a case that happened last week in Zimbabwe, and the avenging spirit was demanding 35 cows, one female elephant, a new house, and a farm, and a tombstone. And this demand came as a result of somebody, a son, who is alleged to have been killed by the father after he was grabbed and pulled his scrotum to death. So the avenging spirit is now coming through one of the family members at night. And these are the words that one of the family members says: if you don't give me a wife, give me a female elephant and 35 cattle and a house and a farmland. My family must also erect a headstone on my grave. I died in 1988, but my grave is in a terrible state. Cattle alone won't quench my thirst for revenge. I would have had 4 children and grandchildren by now if I hadn't been murdered by my own father's henchmen. This is something that happened last week that the traditional leaders are trying to resolve. So fortunate enough, the traditional leader was like, I'm not listening to these demands. He then advised the family to go to the traditional healers to get some recourse to that. So fast forward, in terms of animal law and the culture, we find that the current laws that are currently governing us in Zimbabwe are pre-colonial laws. Most of these laws were enacted in the 1970s, just before our independence, and these are the laws that we are currently using. And most of these laws have been amended in 2001, and we're in 2024. 23 years later, we are still using those old laws, even if they were amended in 2001, but the majority of these laws are pre-colonial. What does this mean? It means that the people that made these laws had a different way of thinking, had a different conviction, had a different culture. So they crafted laws according to what they believed in, and overlooked what we or what the Black community believed in or associated with. So for there are advantages and disadvantages that are associated with the laws that we are currently using. Like, for example, the traditional conservation practices. The totems were a conservation method. Like, for example, I told you that I'm a lion. I'm not allowed to eat a lion. I'm supposed to respect a lion. So naturally, there was some form of conservation that was going on because every person was associated to a certain animal that they weren't supposed to eat, that they weren't supposed to kill. So that was just a natural intersection between culture and the law. But then, unfortunately, the current laws did not consider things like the totems or the indigenous knowledge systems. And now that is what is creating a problem. The sacred animal status also helped to protect some of the animals because they were respected. Community engagement, cultural events promoted animal welfare, awareness leading to low human-wildlife conflict, and then educational opportunities, cultural practices taught empathy and responsibility and acknowledged and allowed for cohabitation. So there are certain cultural practices which were conservative, which promoted good animal welfare practices, but not all of them, which we feel that were overlooked by the current laws, which were made by a different group of people with a different cultural perspective and background. I'll give an example of a snake. In the Black culture, if we see a snake, it's associated with bad luck. If you see a snake on your way home, you are expecting some death news or some injury or something like that. But for the white community, it's just a snake, leave it, let it go. So those different interpretations also have affected people's attitude towards the laws that have been in place. And the challenges of overlooking the cultural and traditional and religious practices is that there's now an increase on human and wildlife conflict. Before, the Black people would cohabit with the animals peacefully or whichever way they would solve them. But as soon as when the laws came in, telling the regulations or telling them what to do and what not to do, we've seen an increase in human-wildlife conflict. We know the Black people were used to going to hunt and they would not be penalized for that. But right now, the laws that prohibit hunting. So the laws have sort of like created enmity between human beings and animals, where they were peacefully cohabiting without any compensation, solving their disputes alone. They can't do that because the law came in between, and now they expect compensators for the crops that were eaten. But it's not like these crops were not being eaten back then when, like years ago. But because the law brought in systems, they now expect compensation for that. And then we also have an increase in retaliation killings. There's no relationship between the animals' culture and beliefs. So why should we leave them when they attack our crops or when they kill our kids trying to fish, trying to hunt, or trying to look for water? So retaliation killings have been on the increase. And we also have some laws which the communities believe are harsh. For example, we have mandatory sentences. If you're found in possession of ivory, it's a 9-year mandatory sentence. Any offense to do with a pangolin, it's a 9-year mandatory sentence. A cheetah, it's a 9-year mandatory sentence. And just before 2020, offenses to do with a python were attracted a 9-year mandatory sentence. And the community lobbied against that 9-year mandatory sentence. They said, you can't send us to jail for 9 years for using a python, because we use it for our traditional practices, our traditional healing practices, and what have you. So we feel it's unfair. So they then reduced from 9 years to 3 years when one is using a python for traditional healing purposes or for traditional activities. And then also what these laws have done is to also disregard traditional courts. So the chiefs and the traditional leaders are very instrumental in enforcing the laws, and they have been enforcing the laws in their own way, the customary way. But now with the introduction of the laws, there has been that disregard where people are now just skipping the procedures and going to the main court and not appreciating the complexities and the sensitivities behind culture and religion and also the law. And then trivialization and lack of enforcement at courts, because some of these beliefs and some of these cultural practices are so important. You'll find that the prosecutors and the magistrates are not, sometimes they're reluctant to enforce and implement the laws because they're also afraid and they also fear for their lives. So if somebody is arrested for possession of a python, definitely the python is not going to come as an exhibit in court because the magistrate and the prosecutor are also afraid of the python. I remember one case which went to court, and this person was found in possession of a python, and they said, it's fine, arrest me, take me to jail. But this python is going to find me here in jail, 50 kilometers away. This python is going to come and find me in jail. And if you want to arrest me, it's up to you. So now there was debate, do we really want to arrest this person and have a python at night in jail? Or do we leave him to go at home? So the courts at times, they are a bit, do we or should we proceed or not? So that is one of the complexities. Last but not least, on the recommendations, there's need for dialogue between the communities, cultural practices, and community engagement, and also legislation review that also incorporates the community's beliefs, practices that are good, and also just awareness on the value of animals is also important. And in terms of education part, we introduced a diploma on wildlife law and policy, and we realized that the law alone is not enough. There is an intersection of the law and other science and other cultural practices. And as part of that diploma includes community-based wildlife management. It includes wildlife management for law officers, and especially on the community-based wildlife management, is just embracing and engaging dialogue and appreciating the differences and the intersection between the law and the culture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul, Jaya, and Ever for those wonderful presentations. And for the next few minutes, I just would like to discuss a topic that I think unites their presentations by focusing on three very powerful forces: faith, compassion, and action. So faith, as we've heard, has been a cornerstone for billions of people around the world, serving as a moral compass and shaping the way we understand our role in this very complex world. And whether it's the Christian principle of stewardship, the Buddhist practice of compassion for all beings, the Muslim concept of Ram, or the Hindu principle of ahimsa, every major faith tradition carries a message of care, respect, and responsibility, not just toward other people, but toward all living beings. So, but one of the things that I think needs to be acknowledged is that I know that many of us don't identify with any religious belief system. Many of us question or simply don't believe in the existence of a god or gods. Many of us carry deep skepticism about organized religion and rightly critique the many harms that have been inflicted on humans and animals and the environment in the name of religion. But regardless of where you stand on the question of religion or faith, what I really want you to think about is that over 80% of the world's population, nearly 6.4 billion people, identify as being part of a faith community. That statistic alone tells us something very important about faith communities, that they hold extraordinary potential for bringing about positive change. So yesterday I was talking about this with Paul Locke, who happens to be sitting right there. And he said, you know, if only 2% of that 6.4 billion, if we were able to just engage only 2% of that community, that would make a huge difference. And so we did the math, and that's 2% is 128 million people. That could be huge. So faith leaders in particular are trusted voices that shape worldviews, and they can inspire people to take action grounded in deeply held values. Imagine for a moment the ripple effect that could take place if faith leaders everywhere spoke openly about animal welfare, encouraging kindness, compassion, and a sense of shared responsibility for the lives of animals. Now, some faith leaders have already embraced this leadership, and they've had an enormously positive impact. They've been working on this for decades. People like Paul Waldau comes to mind, or Andrew Lindsay. So this is something that people are working on and thinking about already, but we need to do more. We need to leverage this even more. So one way this influence of faith leaders can manifest is in something as simple as the food that we choose to eat. For many, dietary choices are automatic, rooted in culture, convenience, habit, or yes, religious belief. But when faith leaders speak to the ethical dimensions of these choices, something profound can happen. People start to see their choices not just as personal preferences, but as moral decisions. Imagine the impact if more people, guided by their faith, chose to embrace a plant-based diet. 128 million, just 2%, they chose that. This small shift could reduce animal suffering, promote better health, and lessen our environmental impact. When framed within the context of faith, these everyday choices become deeply spiritual acts, expressions of compassion and stewardship over all creation. So the potential for faith communities to drive social change isn't just theoretical. History shows us time and again that when faith leaders and communities take action, movements are born. Consider the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Faith communities were at its core. Religious leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who spoke with moral clarity and conviction, inspired an entire generation to fight for justice, equality, and human dignity. Their religious beliefs were not separate from their activism. Rather, they were the very foundation upon which they stood. So today we find ourselves with a similar opportunity to apply that same moral leadership to animal welfare, expanding our circle of compassion to include not only human beings, but also the animals who share this earth with us. And it doesn't stop there. When faith communities take up the cause of animal welfare, they create opportunities for collaboration across sectors. Imagine faith leaders working alongside environmental and public health advocates, all united in the cause of reducing factory farming, promoting ethical food systems, and advocating for policies that ensure food justice and sustainability. So together, these coalitions can create powerful movements that benefit not only animals, but also human health and the environment. For many, the journey toward caring for animals, protecting the environment, and promoting human health is not separate from their spiritual beliefs. It's an extension of them. Faith can provide the grounding, the direction, and the meaning that guide our lives. And so when we invite people to consider animal welfare within that space, we're not just asking them to change their habits. We're really inviting them to reflect, to grow, and to align their actions with the values that matter most to them. So I would like all of us to imagine the possibilities. If we engage faith communities and we create a movement that is more inclusive, compassionate, and deeply aligned with animal protection beliefs, we can encourage our faith leaders to help us think holistically about our impact in this world. So let's support them in working with their congregations to choose compassion in the foods that they eat, the products that they buy, and the policies that they support. And by doing so, we can create even more of a legacy of kindness that uplifts not only animals, but also humanity and the planet. So at this juncture, I would love to invite any of you who have questions for our panelists to please come up to the center microphone. And if you're online, you have a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So please go ahead and put your questions there. And I have questions prepared so I can get the ball rolling while you're all thinking about some questions. All right, so this one, I'm going to start with you, Paul. So what is the difference between an approach that is intersectional and one that is interdisciplinary?
If you look up, the Oxford English Dictionary provides information on how often words are used. Intersectional used to be used in mathematics, but that's probably not most of our domain. In 1987, Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black feminist, used it, and it became much more common, and that's very heavily tracked in the Oxford English Dictionary. Interdisciplinary is a much older word and is used quite a bit more statistically. In some, if you look up a synonym for interdisciplinary or intersectionality, they give each word. But in some circles, intersectionality simply is a human-focused thing entirely. And it's a very important inquiry that some humans have certain sort of benefits and others don't, on the basis of very irrational factors like what's the color of your hair or skin or eyes, or just things that have nothing to do with our moral depth or breadth. So to me, I think generous uses of both of those terms are quite in order. Sometimes it's very politically correct and a little difficult in controlling vocabulary. But the point is, I think both of those words are always after the fact that knowledge isn't balkanized into different fields ultimately in our personal lives. It's actually a holistic thing that we apply in a very living way. And each of those terms, I think, if you look at it and are attentive to how individuals are using it and give them the benefit of the doubt, each of them is quite valuable. I'm much more familiar with the term interdisciplinary. I never use the word intersectionality except in this lecture, or intersectional. That's just not the way, or unless we were talking about driving and running a red light. It's not, those are terms that are, one book's large in my own personal history, but I have to say some of the intersectionality analyses are so intriguing that I think they're both paying a great deal of attention to.
Yes.
This is a question for anyone on the panel, really. Are we not making a mistake as an animal protection movement because we don't work actively to position our work as a social justice movement? So I'm thinking about intersectionality and saying, if we continue to argue that protecting animals is a matter of individual ethics, we don't really get into the systems of power that are leading to systemic exploitation of animals. I'm not talking about neglect of animals by individuals, for example. I'm talking about factory farming and other types of corporate and institutional abuse. So if we were to think about animals in society as a matter of social justice and try understand what power relations in society have got us here and who creates these institutions which exploit animals, would we not then better be able to understand how we might challenge that? So I'm particularly interested, obviously law is one mechanism, and it can either hold back progress or it can be used in some circumstances to spark progress. But if you change the framing away from individual decision-making to challenging and overturning institutional power, then we have a whole different framing for animal protection, and we allow ourselves to work in ways that other social justice movements have in the past, and that might move us forward in terms of protecting animals at a systemic level. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. Thanks so much. And I can speak from India perspective. Animal welfare can be seen pro as well as anti-social justice, depending on who frames it. An interesting exercise was in Hyderabad, there's a university called Osmania University, and they decided to ban beef from their canteens. So they said that, well, we're going to stop beef, like not any other meat. And a whole bunch of Dalit students came together and organized a beef festival. And I had an opportunity to go meet with these students. And they're like, well, if they had made this whole canteen plant-based, we wouldn't have been protesting. Because you're targeting beef, that almost means like it's going after a particular community, and hence we oppose that. On to the other end, when we really look at factory farming, modern day slavery is so common on factory farms. We kind of see that, where slaughterhouse workers, again, modern day slavery is so common. So I do think that, at least from an India point of view, when it comes to positioning in social justice, we seem to be in lost laws. When you have like animal welfare groups, animal rights groups, established ones in India, celebrating cow slaughter bans, which are just a mask for going after a particular community, yet ignoring a large social justice issue that kind of comes up in terms of factory farming, be it in terms of modern day slavery, zero deforestation, so on and so forth. I agree with you. I think that we just, at least from an Indian point of view, a nuanced approach of what's celebrated, what's being brought in, so that we're able to find ourselves within the conversation of social justice, or rather otherwise you end up being in a position where people from the far left and far right both end up exploiting animals for their issues rather than working towards it.
Next question, please.
Yes, my name is Francesca Alamo, and as somebody who was named actually after the patron saint of animals and ecology, I am one of those people that you describe, whose animal activism is rooted in an extension of her faith. So thank you for naming that reality. My question, and also thank you all for your beautiful and indeed holy work in this realm. My question is something that I have noticed anecdotally and also in my studies, is that many of the people, at least in my religious tradition of the Roman Catholic faith, is that many of the people who are most adamantly committed to the Thomistic / Aristotelian notion of the scala naturae, the idea being that human beings lie at the apex of earthly life beneath only celestial beings in worth and dignity, are also those who are most committed to other forms of hierarchy above, namely women and children, and other members of society who are vulnerable. So as someone who is frankly tired of blasting bishops and priests' email addresses with begging for scraps of the theological table, I'm asking, what can we do on the ground in our faith communities to better align with those who could stand in solidarity with the animals, with women and children and other marginalized groups by those who believe in hierarchy? Thank you.
I think if you study any religious tradition, you'll see that it's actually quite internally various. There's a wonderful scholar of Hinduism, Wendy Doniger at University of Chicago, who makes the point. Ahimsa, one of the most beautiful concepts ever, non-harming, was originally in the Indian subcontinent applied to non-human animals. But as time went on, it was so beautiful that it was moved to humans as well. Now that is a good example of how protecting living beings without discriminating on species is something that's just important. You strengthen your muscles by being concerned with any living being, and that travels to the humans or the non-humans, whatever. So for me, religious traditions, when you plumb them deeply, are incredibly rich in insights for how we live. Aristotle and some of the great luminaries in the Western tradition got focused on humans alone. I can understand that why in certain ways, but boy, it didn't come out very cleanly. And today, I think we have a much richer view of the fact that all of us are sitting here with the overlap with chimpanzees of 98% of our genes, which means, gosh, they probably have some abilities we have. Which ones? Well, hopefully not the negative ones, but some of the positive ones. So for me, when it comes to social justice, I don't think you can do social justice just on one species. Justice is a very rich, vibrant concept which moves across the species line. If you hurt non-humans, you're going to be strengthened for hurting humans and vice versa. So for me, the larger community is by paying attention to that, it's the only way we fully self-actualize as human animals. I just think that's just an experience that I think most of us see and realize. And our religious traditions are wonderful vehicles, great data, Pam. 80+% of people around the world vote, I'm religious. It's like, I guess we ought to have them in the conversation then. And the point is that religious traditions can deliver that message so much more effectively than just secular legal systems trying to do it. There is a values base there and a community base, and it is effective when it happens. And when it's ugly, but so is the secular.
Thank you. Yes. Next question, please.
Hello, my name is Alexis Gonzalez. I'm a 3L at DePaul University in Chicago, and I'm also the president of a consortium of law schools in Chicago working to advance animal advocacy. And so my question is kind of within the same vein of Francesca's great question, which is how do we, those of us who are religious or spiritual, how do we actually approach our leaders in conversation about how they could possibly assist us in promoting animal welfare, especially given that, at least in my experience, there's some conflict within the religion. As an example, I'm also Catholic, and Francesca already mentioned how humans are seen versus other animals, and Pope Francis in his recent encyclical has made quite a few nods to the impact that we're making and the considerations that we should be making for animals. So please, any thoughts on that?
I'll start. So both of those issues and questions are so wonderful. Last year, I had a research fellow, and she and I worked on this very issue. And what we developed was what we are terming a project pilot to target, to try at individual congregations to see if we can work with leadership and if we can work with the congregation through leadership to see about, what kind of messages can be delivered, what kind of decision-making can be done, everything from food purchases to what kind of entertainment that they might be engaging in, and on and on and on. And my email's right there. So I encourage you to email me, and I'm happy to put you in touch with her, and we can have more of a conversation this is something that we're developing, and we want to share it freely because we think there's so much potential and so much power. So please do reach out, and we can continue that conversation with Rachel. Does anybody else have anything they want to add?
I don't know the how, but I can just say the why is really important.
Mhm.
Like the halal and kosher certification together is by far the largest food certification system that exists. Like if you were to take all the fair crops and RSPO certified and organic certified, all of the food certification systems on one hand, and just look at halal and kosher on the other, just like by the orders of magnitude, it's a much larger certification system. And imagine a world where we're able to get someone to say that confining those birds in battery cages is not halal. Like, but at a click, we could get a vast number of Muslim majority countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, a lot of the Middle East, just like get rid of cages. So I think the power to engage is really high. I sadly don't know how to engage though.
Just a comment. First of all, thank you for the work you do. That's really, really important. I like the word religion. It's got a very complex history, and the understanding of religion today isn't what it was 1,000 years ago. We sometimes think of it as a system. It actually has to do a lot with daily life. Today, the word spiritual is actually used very, not aggressively, that's not the right word, actively by certain atheists. And some people say, how's that possible? And the answer is, it's always been possible. Buddhists themselves are often not classical theists, but are richly, richly spiritual. I think both of these terms, if you encounter people who use them responsibly and live full life, live their values, are incredibly valuable. And once when I was at Oxford, I did religion and animals as a thesis, and people would come over to the place I lived at for dinner and wine. And usually after several bottles of wine, people would say, why would you ever do religion and animals? What does it have to do with anything? Are you really religious? And I wasn't affiliated at the time, and I said, no. And a really good friend, who's still a very good friend, says, oh, no, but you're very spiritual. I thought, I'm going to tell that story in the future. Because I could sense that he meant something so beautiful by that. I hope I've tried to live up to that. I think religion at its best is spectacularly human and beautiful. One last story, ahimsa. Because it was developed for non-human animals moving over to the humans, you think this is a whole community. And the Animal Legal Defense Fund is such a cutting edge for animal studies. So Joyce, thank you for doing this. It is what allows someone like me to come up and talk about animal studies in these broad ways, because this broad spirit that ALDF people universally use is something so akin to the very best of spirituality, the best of religion, and the best of ethics. It's just an exemplification of how human animals could be so beautiful, if I can put it that way. So thank you. I mean, I really think we're not going forward without religion. We're not. So let's get along with them, and let's use all their insights for ourselves.
Thanks, everyone.
Dawn, I'll just add on and say sometimes when you're dealing with religious leaders, it's very difficult to engage in a conversation on the real issue. But if you engage them from a remote, indirect issue, eventually it will add up and affect the way things are being done. I know, for example, like Roman Catholic Church, there've been changes that have happened, not directly attacking the real issue in the room, but naturally with, things are just dynamic. The world is just changing, that eventually the change that you want to see will just happen. So it might be engaging on a health issue, engaging on a whatever, that will then eventually change, certain religious or belief systems that will work in favor of the animals.
Thanks. Thank you. And we have time for one last very quick question.
Okay. I'm not sure if I should try to bend over because of my height. Okay, so my question was mostly, I think maybe you might have touched a little bit on it now in the answer, Eva. But I wanted to speak about the idea of the African use of animals in terms of communications, and also maybe borrowing from if you look at African literature, whether from all regions of Africa, West, Eastern, you're looking at Chinua Achebe's, the Gabriel Okara's, or even Southern African, like our own very authors in Zimbabwe, and their use of imagery and style in their writing using to communicate, like especially colonialism, when they used imagery of animals to communicate the situations and point out the pictures of what was happening. Now I want to, I'm asking about if we already had if we already had this nuance where we were able to actually expose colonialism or the marginalization of women using animal imagery in such a positive way, but now having the distance in trying to merge the dialogue of bringing the education of about animal welfare into Africa, especially because it seems to many Africans, I mean, I take it from my experience, I did some work in rural KZN, and I realized that when you're talking about animals, animal rights sounds more like a too Western or Eurocentric idea. So how do we then put the whole idea to say, but even though as Africans, there's been a message that the Western has been able to understand when we were exposing things that were unfavorable to us by using the imagery of animals. I mean, all forms of animals, like the bird to talk about freedom and our nostalgia for it, and the lions to talk about our wish for leadership and all. But now, how do you think that, how do you think we can merge that thing without actually sounding Eurocentric, sounding like we are bringing, because sometimes it sounds like you're bringing I mean, it doesn't matter whether I'll use myself and Tony in this. It doesn't matter whether it's Tony speaking the subject on the subject because he's a white South African or a white African man, or myself speaking on it as a Black African man. We both sound like we are bringing in a Eurocentric idea. But how do we then bring in the whole idea to say, but there is a merge between these two, because it's all one in terms of its objective?
Thank you.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, acknowledging the good practices that we already have, and then introducing new concepts or introducing new subjects or Eurocentric subjects would be the way to go. I know, for example, not really linked to culture and religion, but when I graduated from Lewis and Clark, going back to Zimbabwe, everybody's like, okay, she's coming from America. Tell us, like you're not in touch with the real world. But I couldn't go and start to talk about animal rights because I felt it was too extreme and it was too far-fetched. So I started talking about or introducing about the value of animals and talking about wildlife, and talking about wildlife, because that is the language they understand. Those are the animals that they value and they appreciate. So after 7 years of working and lobbying and pushing on the value of animals, right now I feel I'm ready to even now talk about farmed animals. But 6, 7 years back then, it was hard, it was impossible. So you start with what people relate with, what they understand, then gradually introduce the conversation and new subjects or concepts. But sometimes you might think they're new, yet they already exist, but not in the manner in which we might want to package them. Thank you.
Join me in thanking Paul, Jaya, and Ever for these wonderful presentations.